Goedenavond allemaal. Bonsoir à tous. Et bienvenue. Nous sommes ravis de vous accueillir ce soir pour une conférence donnée par Job Floris, l'un des fondateurs du bureau Monadnock. Job Floris heeft in 2006 samen met Sander Noos dit Nederlandse bureau opgericht. Ils ont tous les deux travaillé en Belgique avant de poursuivre leur parcours professionnel à Rotterdam, où ils implantent leur bureau en 2006. Job Floris stelt jullie enkele van hun projecten voor binnen het thema dorpsarchitectuur, het overkoepelende onderwerp van het laatste nummer van het tijdschrift A+ Architecture in Belgium. Leurs projets, d'une apparente simplicité, sont réfléchis dans les moindres détails au point de prendre des allures de manifeste. Ze staan ook in het architectuuronderwijs en ze publiceren theoretische teksten over architectuur. Job Floris was ook lange tijd redactielid van OA's Journal for Architecture. Le langage architectural de Monadnock répond aux enjeux identitaires auxquels les villages d'aujourd'hui sont confrontés. Pour la conférence de ce soir, Monadnock se base sur son propre travail afin de développer une réflexion sur les thèmes de l'identité de la communauté et de la municipalité. Voordat ik Job Floris woord geef, willen we graag bedanken onze structurele sponsor ASA Abloy Intern Systems, onze structurele partner Febelsem, de Vlaamse overheid, la ville de Bruxelles, la région de Bruxelles-Capitale ainsi que la Fédération Wallonie-Bruxelles, pour le soutien qu'ils apportent à notre cycle de conférences. Enfin, je tiens à remercier Beaux-Arts pour la coproduction de cet événement et je vous souhaite à tous une très bonne conférence.
Good evening. Thank you for inviting me here to speak in the A+ lecture series about our work of Monadnock in the famous Beaux-Arts. Thank you for the introduction, Lara, and thank you for all for coming in such big amounts. So I'm going to talk about 3 projects which are all close to a city. This is our office in Rotterdam. During the lecture, I will use the plural we, since all the products in the practice of Monadnock are developed by Sander Noos and me and a team of dedicated collaborators. Tonight I'm going to speak about 3 projects, so in approximately 1 hour I'm going to try. I will speak about the Landmark Building in Nieuwbergen, the Netherlands, the Atlas House in Eindhoven, also in the Netherlands, finishing with a larger project, the Park Pavilion in Otterlo, which is also in the east of the Netherlands. All these 3 projects are close to a city. Some are further away, some are closer, all are relating in their own specific way to rurality. But before I continue with this, let me first allow me first to briefly contextualize what I'm going to show to you, because when giving a lecture, it is a bit of a habit to start with a short explanation of the name of our office. I do that every time, and it's still necessary, so it seems so. Let's not stop with that. So the word Monadnock is actually derived from a type of mountain. We found this out, that it's a type of mountain, after an encounter with this building in Chicago, which is called the Monadnock Building. And we fell in love with this building. And it's relevant to talk about this building because it's a beautiful building. And it also carries a couple of ideas about architecture that relate to our practice. So it was realized by two pairs of architects over a period of approximately 15 years. It was built in steel and in brick, so two different parts carrying one name. And you could say that we are more in favor of this brick part, but that is not so important. What is more important is that these two parts are giving a complete different explanation or articulation to architecture. So one is a load-bearing brick building, big brick construction, among the largest brick constructions in the world, and the other part is a steel construction. So it's also, in a way, explaining a difference in building culture. This was the old archaic material of brick, and this is the new material of the future, steel. And the funny thing is that when we talk about this building with people that are less informed about architecture, then they tend to think that this part is the newest part and this one is the oldest part, which is not a strange thing. It's the opposite. This is the newest in steel and this is the oldest part in brick. It's not so strange because the language of the building is so different. I can show you perhaps best here that this is much more, the newest part is much more decorated or ornamented, and the whole expression of this building is much more reduced, uses a different technique of ornamentation, but also articulation. Everything comes from one material, the brick. The brick makes actually a cornice, makes a plinth in the bottom, while the other part of the building uses added material. It's not so strange, I think, that these architects, Hollebert and Roche, used, let's say, the conventions of classical ornamentation to articulate or give articulation to their building, because the shock of the new might have been too hard. While Mr. John Wellborn-Root was studying approximately 10 years on the exact shape of this building. He was inspired not by, let's say, the Beaux-Arts classical architecture referring to the Roman and Greek tradition, but he was studying Egyptian motifs, and that brought him to a very reduced and simple building block with beautiful details, like this is happening in the plinth of the building. So it's like a block of clay. It's bulbing out like a belly. And if you look at the bay windows here or the oriels, it's very, it's expressing plasticity. It's almost bulbing out of the facade in 3 dimensions, which is also quite refined and specialized. And here you can also see it. And this heavy plinth, so all the classical elements like a plinth and a cornice are made of the same material, and this plinth is then also making very deep window reliefs, and this is also a very beautiful detail going from a very sharp edge in the plinth of the building all the way up, gradually to a rounded cornice. Now, that is control, I think, and also refinement. So it's also ornament, but it makes the block less absolute, more elegant. Now, we are here to talk about village architecture and about rurality. So, what I would like to start with is a bit of a longer reflection on this before we go to the projects. So let's make a jump. We go to the Netherlands. These are the polders. This is where we are located, our practice, the flat low countries. being in the river delta, the context of artificial land. And on reflecting on the identity of a village, we probably have to try to also define what rural is. And that's also a bit where the problem begins. Because currently we find ourselves in an environment which is quite hard to define. In our contemporary condition, it's hard to define the edge of a city. Our cities have grown together, and we live in a condition which is like an endless clustering or sprawl. And this also makes it hard to define the beginning of rurality, I think. And it raises all kinds of questions. Does it have to do with the scale of communities or the social conventions of a closed community or a small community? Or perhaps it's the relation to nature? Because I would say geographically, almost every current village is heavily depending on a city which is nearby. So we could almost also say that everything is perhaps a city, at least when I reflect on the landscape in the Netherlands. This might be quite a bold statement, so perhaps it's good to nuance these statements. I'd rather speak about the identity of a context. So let us reflect on the relations we make with context, and rurality might slip in through the back door then. But I think it's good to tell you that the nascence of our thinking in our practice is the thinking of the architecture of the city. It's the beginning of in the beginning of our practice was this quite literally heavy buildings forming streets and urbanities, and to a certain level this is still valid. But nowadays we have understood this in the more broader sense. The city of civic moments or monuments, in the understanding of streets and typologies, of course, or places with identity. And we have also simultaneously understood that one is able to make exceptions, making architecture which is more ambiguous and double-sided. I'm showing you two images of architecture of Aldo Rossi. And both projects are in suburbia, I would say. And I think architecture could also be something that could be big and also could also represent something small. Something small could also represent something big. And sometimes it could be coherent and simultaneously assembled. In the projects of our practice, we also search for, let's say, location-specific information, because we always try to encrypt this in our projects. So we try to anchor a building in a specific context to prevent it from becoming footloose and create the impression that it could land just anywhere. But this is not something you should take very literal. Context is not the holy grail. We also search for autonomy in the project. And I think, therefore, we should also allow ourselves to enrich the vocabulary of architecture with more exotic or imported motives, which are empathically not locally inspired. After all, certain motives are relevant and necessary in several places. And I think the balancing act that we try to do is to find a good balance between autonomy and being specific. So that's contextualizing a bit the projects that I'm now going to talk about. Having said this, we go to the landmark in New Bergen. This building was realized in 2013. That's this building. It's located here, close to the German border. And well, we are located here. It's an hour and a half driving, so it's not so far. Brussels from Rotterdam is also an hour and a half. What I would like to tell about this village called Nieuw-Bergen is that it is part of a development that we can find everywhere. It's a so-called new town. So we have a provincial road going from one city to another city. We have the river Maas, Meuse, and then in between we have an old authentic village called Bergen. When that village began to grow, they created a second village called Nieuw-Bergen on the other side of the provincial road. And this Nieuw-Bergen did not have anything authentic or original because it was new. So it was also built according to the new formula of that time, being a new town with dominance for the car. So instead of a nice, cozy church, it would have a parking lot with, in the middle, with a very efficient ring of shops around it. So it was very easy to reach this parking lot from the provincial road and do your shoppings there and then return to your other village. And this whole area here is filled with small villages which all have their own church tower, so-called church villages. Nieuw-Bergen is too new to have a church and too small. So we did this invited competition for a new landmark in the center of this village. And that is a difficult question because it also took us a while to understand this. Because the only brief that was given, or the only requirement that was given, was to propose a building that would function as a landmark, nothing more. You could say that this new town was actually screaming for identity or for more of the collective. You could also say that the commission was to implement a civic gesture. So you have to imagine that here is the town hall for the whole municipality. This is the new situation with a new block of shops, and this is the landmark. And the project developer implemented this new block of houses and shops there to actually avoid this big square with parkings to survive. So this was turned into a small market, and on the end of the market we find the focus point, and that is the landmark. This landmark building, the bringer of identity, is a strange element because it cannot be a religious building. It can also not be a private building. It's also not completely owned by the municipality, but yet it should express civicness or relate to the civic. Well, these are the pictures we took of the old situation. I'm not getting happy when I see these. And what we do when we have such an open brief, such an open question, we start making collections. And making collections is very open, but also a very effective way to force ourselves to formulate what we would like to make. So if we know that we have to make a landmark, we think of a vertical element and start collecting vertical elements referring to the mine industry in the area, referring to industrial structures. Some of these structures are out of one piece with one continuous cladding. Others are assembled, a house with something on top. and all of them have a very characteristic form. And then we start doing our tests. And we first thought that these small vertical elements should function as something small combined with something big, and that is actually what we found making these collections. But that was not the only part of the story. Then you still have to define what the character of the building is, what is actually its status in the collective. And then we found another example. And that other example was the typology of the trade building. A trade building for measurements and weight in the municipality. And we could find these typologies of the trade buildings in almost every ancient or medieval marketplace, or let's say a lot of medieval marketplaces in the Netherlands, but also in Belgium and also in Germany. And these buildings have a very specific status. They are not religious, they are part of, let's say, collectiveness. They have a very, in most cases, a very special location, because they are, in a lot of cases, freestanding. They have strange proportions. They're very narrow and high. They're richly and materialized with quite exotic motifs. And it's a small building that wants to be very, very, very important. Now, that is a very helpful thing when you have a relatively small budget to make a landmark. We also liked the typology that is hidden inside. That is one very dynamic ground level and a more calm, let's say, administrative first floor. We came to this proposal, and in this proposal we make a small house that is actually a proud, you could say, proud civic house. And on top of that house we stacked two towers. The two towers have a relation with the wider environment, while the small house tries to relate to the market. And this is a building that is visible from all sides, so we could not make a backside. We also wanted to make this building from certain points look very massive and solid, and from other points more open and loose. And this civicness is also something that crossed our minds when we were thinking of a very optimistic and transparent and open building. But simultaneously we knew that we had to close some of the parts of the building, because we did have to solve very simple things like circulation. But we were not able, let's say, to make a backside. So the building has different faces. And the whole challenge for us was to give these different faces expression without losing coherence. So it should still be a very simple and readable building. This is the diagram. And we saw this old fortress, and on these old fortresses, to enter the top of the tower, you have this very small tower, this miniature tower that allows you to enter the roof. It closes up off the stairs. And that helped us a lot, because of course we started first by making proposals for a tower in the middle, and one tower which then would be insulated, which would be very problematic. And then this was a good solution for stepping over, dividing the tower into two, a small tower and a big tower. So the small tower is insulated, then you enter the balcony and you have a look over the market square, and then you enter the higher tower. And when you enter the higher tower, you end up on top, and then you have a view over the area. We proposed a bar or cafe in the plinth or in the ground level of this building. It took approximately, I think, 3 or 4 years, or perhaps even longer, before this really happened. And all the time it was empty, functioning a bit like a folly, you could say, because it was standing there silently in the middle of the village. And it was possible to pick up the keys at the town hall, and then you would be able to enter to the first balcony and then all the way to the top. And that is still the way it works, but now the bar owner is, of course, the eyes, so to say, that control. So turning the tower, the high tower, caused an orientation which was not necessarily towards the market, but was also, let's say, orientating to other sides throughout the village over a longer distance. It also caused the two towers, let's say, to merge from certain viewpoints. That's what you see happening here. And this is a picture, not a rendering. And here you can see that the main, let's say, the most monumental facade is on the market side. That is the main address. And we have applied a grid that is wrapped all around. And we tried to make a system that could form several faces or masks, if you like. So here it has the maximum openness, where the windows are pushed together to actually form almost one window. And there are all kinds of elements in this building that relate to elements that the inhabitants of the village would understand. That was also one of the requests, to use a local brick, to use bricks. So the use of a lintel and an arch, but an arch doesn't really have the same function anymore as it used to have. So we gave priority to the grid over the arch, also nuancing the arch. These are the facades, and here you can see that we, on the other side, actually separate the windows again, where they individualize. And on the market part, we make it completely open here, the two arched windows, and here it's closed off again. And this is the scheme of the building. It's very simple. There's one big column in the middle that actually takes care of the support of this tower. Then 1/4 of the square is occupied by circulation, storage, and technicalities, in such a way that the rest can be open and that it can have contact to all sides, although this is the main side to the market square. But sitting here in the bar, you immediately have contact with people passing by. So this is a narrow alley. So here you're closer to the facade, and here you're further away. This building is in situ poured concrete, and then afterwards covered with a thin layer of bricks, and that gives actually all the expression. In Dutch building culture, it's rather unusual to use in situ poured concrete. We use prefab or steel, but steel would actually cause diagonals in front of the windows, and that's something that the architect really did not want. So the solution was in situ poured concrete, and on top of that we have a steel tower. And the steel tower is actually open. The wind blows through to also prevent too much tension on the tower. The tower contains only a stair to go up. That's what you can see here, and brings you to the viewpoint. And you have a beautiful view, not only to the other church villages in the area, but also to a small, to a natural park, Maasduinen called. And here you can see that the whole scheme is very simple. 2 floors, but on the way we also have split levels here and toilets on the way. So it's slightly more complicated than that, and all the installations are solved on top of the small tower. We used 1 red brick for this, and then did something we had not done before, and that is painting the brick. Because we were actually raised with the idea, or trained as architects with the idea that the brick is a beautiful material, pure material that offers a sufficient amount of beauty, you could say, the material itself. But in this project, we noticed that choosing 1 type of brick and 1 color of brick would actually not be sufficient. And we found this brick that is actually painted on 2 sides, on 1 head, so to say, on the short side, and 1 long side, the stretcher. And we liked the idea of doing something with these bricks that would allow us to build up a narrative that would enrich the structure of the building more. So to make bonds that were familiar to the inhabitants of New Bergen, because these bonds are being used all over the area. By taking out the paint, or by adding paint, we were able to make these patterns. And some patterns, like I said, are very local, and there are also exotic bonds like the Brazilian bond here, which was very helpful to, let's say, open the tower, because then the wind could blow through. And we also switched the patterns of the brickwork. That's something you will see in the pictures. There are all kinds of conventional elements again, like lintels here, and columns. And we used it also as a way to make the mask of the building different. So on places where we're not able to make windows, we make blind windows by changing the pattern. And on one side, the pattern has the red bricks have the priority, and on the other side, the green bricks have the priority. So there are all kinds of small differences when you circle around this building. Quite nuanced. You will only see it when you're hanging around for a while. And this is the building. Also still closed, as you can see, and empty. And this grid was quite fundamental for us, because if you would take away the grid, we were afraid that the whole building would fall apart, that the different faces would be too, let's say, chaotic, or that the order was unreadable. So the grid is nothing else than an articulation of order, because it does not have a structure behind it, not at all. It's actually, the wall behind it is just smooth concrete. And the horizontal here is also not indicating the floor, because the floor is somewhere here. We raised it in order to make the ground level more monumental or big or important. And here you can see the Brazilian bond being opened, while the other tower is closed and insulated. And here you can see the switch in priority of the green lines to the red lines. And this is what you see when you're on top. There you can see some church villages in the area. And you could say that this tower is, it's actually a house plus a tower. And this tower is a sort of, well, billboard. You see, it's a very simple steel structure. And the interior is also rough. It's the backside of the billboard. It's a folded billboard because the outside is representative, or representing, you could say, the landmark, but the inside can remain like this. The bricklayers gave a phone call whether they should smoothen this, and this is much nicer, the beards hanging out. So we like that contrast. And it's also standing on high heels. So it's emphasizing in that sense also the fact that it's a sort of symbol. I've already talked a bit about the grid, and in the grid there are all kinds of thoughts embedded. So if you make the grid much deeper, then it starts to step away from the surface behind it. And we thought that with the depth of the grid that we chose here, we did some explorations in plaster, that with the depth of this grid, you could actually still see it as a coherent unity, while when you make it deeper, it starts to really step away. This is an image of Muzio in Milano, because of course we had the problem here with our grid, that when a column meets a lintel, how you make the joint? Well, then you give priority to the lintel. But when you come at the corner, you have a very classical problem. You cannot continue with the lintel, because then when it starts freezing, the bricks actually pop out. And that's something that that we took a look at, the way that Muzio actually expressed how the lintel is going around the corner, and at how it gets priority over the vertical column. I know it's covered by a leaf, so therefore you cannot see it. I tried to arrange a new picture, but I didn't manage, unfortunately. So the next time you are there, take a look at the beautiful way he solved it. It's a typical Italian solution, because it's a one singular brick here, which is square in its plan. And that is something, I call it an Italian solution, because it goes along with the climate, because the freezing is not hard enough to have this problem that we would have here in the north. So our solution is actually that we continue the column here, and that the lintel slightly eats into the column here and finds it ending in this way. And here you can also see that the bricks are only a raincoat, so to say, and giving expression to the facade. This is how you find the building in its setting. And on the left side, you can see the original buildings of the new town, and on the right side, you see the new shops that were implemented. And we didn't want to be part of the left side and neither from the right side, because we thought that the left side was too shallow and the right side was too nostalgic. And this nostalgia is, of course, a theme that is also something we get confronted with, whether this building is not too nostalgic. And we don't think so, because it is a translation of certain conventions that were alive in this area and also in other places that we translated. And it needs to be a standalone, this building. And although we have tried to make a lot of references to a local building culture, the people of New Bergen recognized this as a mosque, which was for us not necessarily a problem, but for the villagers was an alien element. But gradually they started to appreciate this, and in the recent, or one of the carnival celebrations in the small village, we saw 3 cars with these towers that were mimicked, so to say, or rebuilt in all kinds of colors. So I think that's a token of embracement. And later we found out that this is a tower that is standing on the cemetery of the original authentic village of Bergen, which is a beautiful ruin. So it would be nice if our tower could also grow old like this and become part of the identity of New Bergen. Now I'm going to talk about another small project, the Atlas House, that's in Eindhoven. It's this house. Eindhoven is close to New Bergen, actually. Also in the southeast of the Netherlands. And it's in an area called Strijp R, which is a beautiful former industrial quarter of Eindhoven. And it's close to a big the English word would be, let's say, a private-owned park, an estate of the owners of the Philips company, which was originated in Eindhoven. And because everybody wants to have a house and a garden, in the Netherlands we make very rational plans and very regular plans, and then there are always, this is actually the estate, by the way, called the Ville. It's beautiful with beautiful old trees, and we are somewhere here. I was talking about the urban layout of these new areas. So they are regular, and then there are always moments where it becomes a bit more difficult to be regular. And then when it becomes too difficult, we give them to people that want to build their own house, or to people that have more money to spend to build their own house, because these plots are sold for a higher price because they have, of course, a beautiful view over this estate. So it may sound a bit cynical, but it is a bit the Dutch definition of freedom in your own small house, which in Belgium is a bit different, because everybody builds its own house. But here in the Netherlands, we have certain reserves for that. So our clients, very brave people, have obtained this small plot, among other plots, and they had a very fierce wish to make their own house. And they obtained the plot. it's a small plot, and they want to have a big garden and a big house, and they had a small budget. So we said yes to the commission, and because it's challenging, and we proposed two options. One option was to make a bungalow with the garden in the middle, so you live around your garden, and you make one floor. The other option was to step back and try to make a footprint that was as compact as possible, because then you would have some garden around your house. Besides, you would have a bit of distance from your neighbors, because the neighbors are really nearby, really close. And again, the beauty is that you have a beautiful view in these between the crowns of the trees. So this was the proposal that won, a so-called tower house with a compact footprint of, let's say, 8 by 8 meters and a height of 14 meters. And it means that you have to organize the program in such a way that you can live in a vertical way, so to say. So you have to divide all the things on top of each other instead of spreading them out. Otherwise, the garden is gone. So what we do then when we develop these ideas for a design, we also make images that express an ambition. This image is not to prove that in an early stage of the design process we were already, let's say, completely in control and knowing what we were doing, and it now looks exactly the same. No, it was more a research tool. To make images helps in defining the composition, defining all the elements that are necessary to give character to the house. We had long discussions with our client about the position on the plot, because we were convinced that placing the house parallel to the street would be less interesting for them, inhabiting the house, having views from the interior to the exterior through the crowns of the trees. We thought that it would be more dynamic when you would turn the house slightly, because then you would be able to look along the length of the street here, instead of looking straight ahead into the crowns of the trees, which would give more depth and dynamics. It's a very simple house. Finally, they agreed, as you can see. But it didn't come easy. We had to be there together with the clients on the stair to have a look, to mimic the situation of looking out of a window. But I'm very happy that we were able to convince them. It's a very simple scheme. It's a simple scheme existing out of rooms, 5 rooms, but then repeated on every floor. So 3 small rooms, 2 big rooms. And for us it was important, this formulation of rooms, that you would always be very aware of crossing from one room to the other room, that there was always a boundary defining this room as being one. So no matter how open you would make this boundary, you would always be, you would always experience this. So we also think it's a collection of rooms, because the rooms can be inhabited in a certain way. At this moment, for example, the ground floor is now for working, the first floor is for living, and the top floor is for bath and sleeping and a bit of working. But over the years this could change. Perhaps they start living on the ground level and start working on the top. But the good thing is at least that there's a big terrace, so there's a certain flexibility. You can either be out here in your garden or on top of your house. And the outside of the house does not immediately reveal what is happening inside. Again, the story of the mosques is being further developed here as a motive. Every side is almost individualized and then placed together. So there are rules, of course, for these for the composition of these windows. We wanted to make a very clear distinction between plinth and what is on top of the plinth to give a certain robustness for the house, sort of rustication, while the top of the house could be more light and more open. But let's first go back to the composition of the windows. It does not reveal anything that is happening inside. But the inside is actually offering the variety. So the plan is always, the emblem of the plan is always the same, but the height is always different. And actually that individualizes every room. There are no similar rooms, you could say, because it's always different. That means that you have a dining room of 4 meters high and a living room next to it, which is much lower. And then again, working room, which is higher. Sleeping room, again, more intimate. This is a Losian plan in that sense. The section is actually telling the story of variety and connections. So we started with the idea of using one brick for the inside and the outside, and actually we thought that it would be a clever and also wise decision to make it equal budget-wise. Then we found out that it's not so, that it was hard to find a brick that would also work in the interior in a similar way as the exterior, because the expression of the brick on the exterior would have other demands than the expression of the brick of the interior. Nevertheless, we decided to keep it rough, and if the inhabitants would like to do something with it later, they would be able to cover it, but they would start with a blank, or no, let's say an unpolished surface. And we also thought that was a cheap way of doing. And this is the house in its, not in its current state, but how it all started. You can see the fences are still around the plot. And later the neighbors came to visit, and they enclosed this house. And I will also show you the second session that Stijn Bollaert made of this project. Here you can see the line of trees. And here you can also see that there are big differences in composition, and simultaneously everything is wrapped and treated in a similar way. But this composition is not necessarily taking the other side into account. The jumps that are taking place are actually individualizing it. We also looked at these Phoenician palaces where you see that the windows are pushed all the way to the side. And that became also a bit of a theme, that the weight is more in the middle. Yes, I will tell something about that. That the weight is in the middle. And by pushing the windows all the way to the side, there would also be a certain thinness. Besides being in the interior, the two windows would meet each other, and you would obtain bay windows, which actually anticipates a bit on the turning of the volume. So this relation starts to appear more. And these windows might look, let's say, perhaps a bit simple and easy, but we study, we make variants, and it takes us a while to come to decisions. Sometimes it takes us a big load of tests before we come to a conclusion. Sometimes we really want to be very, very, very sure of something before we go for it. And this is a selection of the tests that we did. And it brings you perhaps also to people like Venturi, because again we used the motive of of painting the brick, but this time with a white slurry, which was literally added on the building site. And what we learned from Venturi here, especially in this project of the fire station, is the figuration of this white surface, which is in dialogue with the building, but also neglecting the building. It's stepping away, it's neglecting the window here, it's neglecting the end of the building. It's making its own figure, obeying to the tower and then not obeying anymore. And that is something that we find intriguing, because this thin layer of paint brings figuration, brings a narrative to the facade. So where the project Nieuwbergen has plasticity and tectonics in the facade, our facade of the Atlas House is very flat. And the flatness was then disturbed, so to say, by the layer of paint. And there's also a neo-Renaissance tradition in the Netherlands and also in other places, also in Belgium, I guess. And here we add all kinds of plaster elements to give expression to conventional elements like a keystone and horizontal linings, to actually make a very simple and banal building out of red brick, to embellish that and give it more status, give it more beauty, and more refinement and more skill. This is done in a very simple and almost, I would say, cheap way, because it's plaster, it's not a natural stone. And you can find this everywhere, and this is especially in The Hague, for example, there are whole neighborhoods like this. And that also actually informed the way we could treat the facade. So a robust plinth with a brick that is double high, referring to a sort of rustication. And then after the plinth, we would counter this actually by making the whole building more light, more textile-like. And this lightness and textile-like appearance has its climax in the slight bending or curving of the top. And here you see the other side. And you see that the keystones start here as an element referring to the old keystone on top of a window. But actually here are also lintels. And then the keystone starts to stand on top of a lintel. And sometimes it escapes. Sometimes it completely escapes and starts to form a dialogue with the composition of the complete facade. You might wonder why these surfaces are here and why this door is here. But you will see later that a balcony will be placed in front. And I was using the word textile. We have put a lot of effort in finding the right joints. So the surface is not so flat. It has actually a very rich surface because the joints are bulbing out and are are brushed. And here you can also see that when you are very consequent in treating only the facade or the frontal surface of the facade and not the reliefs of the windows, you actually get ornaments for free, like here. And here you see how the joints are brushed. And yes, our clients receive questions from people passing by whether the building is finished. But they are used to it by now. It took us a while to find this out, how this could work. We look at the architecture or the brickwork of Klas Anshelm, but also Lewerens. And you see that that the joint can play quite an important role in the whole articulation and the whole appearance of the building, especially the tactility. So there were a lot of tests like this to find out what was the right answer. And I think now you can see that the layer of the joints actually binds it all together and gives the right amount of tactility, and also adds up to the idea of a certain textile appearance. Now we go back to the interior, the rooms. So 2 big rooms, 3 small rooms. The middle room contains the stairs, and the stairs bring you up and up all the way to the roof terrace, and up and then down and then up again. And yes, these things are caused, of course, by the changes in the floors. And this is the room where the stairs are being built in. And these are the stairs. Wooden stairs. Quite a puzzle. And the bricklayer was somebody that felt challenged by also exactly cutting off the curve. Here a view from the roof terrace. And this is the current situation where you can see that there's a garden and there's more life around the house. And that you can see there's a small table standing in front of the door to prevent getting wet, or a better announcement of the entrance. These tables is something that we have seen, for example, in the architecture of Joseph Frank, where something massive is almost countered by something light, which is added to it. And here you also see the balcony, and now it makes sense, the door, because if you want to live here on this floor and do want to have your access to the garden, then you need a small balcony. And the interior, well, this was the starting point. And I already mentioned that we thought that we were clever, but of course we were not so clever because we had to draw all the lintels. Well, I know in Flanders it's more, or in Belgium it's more normal to end up in these rough settings, but in the Netherlands it's quite unusual, and we thought that it was that was a nice challenge, but of course we also had to draw then all the sockets and had to be in control not only of the bond and all the connections of the exterior, but also of the interior. And this is a different brick with the same size, and it has a different appearance. It's not handform, as we call it, but it's a more smooth texture, and it has 2 textures. One side is burnt, and the other one is, let's say, is more rough, is pulled, so to say. Here you see the pulled side, which is more tranquil. And here you can also see the interior window. And how you go from one room to the other room, from the dining room to the living room, and how the two windows meet in the interior. And the dining room. And of course, these elements are very important, although they are very futile. That at the same time, if you leave them out, it becomes one definition of one room. And I think then these two jumps are insufficient. You also need the walls to accompany such a jump. And this is what I meant with a bay window, where the two windows meet, nearly kiss. We were not daring to bring them closer together. So the bricks are also the construction of the house. There's no added steel. And now you can also see that the inhabitants started to paint parts of the interior, and of course we were first shocked. But then again, we proposed painting the outside, or parts of the outside, ourselves. So why not continue this also for the inside? And I must say that it looks pretty good. And this is the bathtub, something which is rather intimate, but at the same time, it's a beautiful concrete bathtub. And this is how it is standing there in the street nowadays, surrounded by friends. And now the inhabitants are very happy that it's slightly turned, because they don't have this vis-a-vis situation. They have a beautiful garden now around the house, and the most intimate part of the house is on top, where you can walk around naked without being seen by your neighbors, and you walk between the crowns of the trees. And this is the last project I'm going to talk about. I'll make this a quicker one. This is about nature and assemblage, the Park Pavilion. It's a building in the National Park, the Hoge Veluwe, also in the east of the Netherlands. This is the National Park, the Hoge Veluwe. It's among the biggest national parks in the Netherlands, and it has a very long history that almost requires a lecture in itself. But we call it a holy ground because in this park there are buildings by Berlage, and also Henry van der Velde has made a beautiful museum here, Columella Museum, with an extension of Wim Quist. And our new Park Pavilion, or visitor center, is located here in the middle of the park. And that was a very well thought consideration by our clients, our commissioners. They wanted to have the visitor center in the middle of the park, close to the other events in the park, because then everybody would enter from several sides into the park, and then they would first experience the park before they were being welcomed at the visitor center. Which solved a very practical problem, having 3 entrances. Then where's the visitor center? You cannot make 3 visitor centers, so they placed it in the center. And this visitor center was a competition, and we collaborated together with the Zwarte Hond, the Black Dog, a Dutch office. And this is, by the way, the Wim Quist and Henry van der Velde Columella Museum. And this is the situation as you can find it right now. Well, you have to imagine that there is a landscape plan by H&S landscape architects that proposed an open space in the forest. So this is one of the biggest or the bigger forests in the Netherlands. It's not an original forest, it's planted, but it has a huge diversity of of landscapes. And in this area, we have a lot of pine forest, and the museum is not so far away. And the idea of the landscape architect was to make an open space in the forest. And in this open space, there would be a conglomeration of buildings. Museonder, which is existing bicycle repair shop, and the visitor center. And the visitor center would be visible from this continuing road all the way over a parking lot, and then it would be a point of orientation. So 3,000 square meters is the visitor center. It contains a restaurant, it contains a shop, and it contains meeting rooms. And the 3,000 square meters was quite a big program to build in nature. And it raised, of course, also all kinds of questions how to behave as an architect in such a beautiful landscape, how to behave in nature. And this is what Berlage did. Berlage actually did something quite smart or clever. He took up a sort of theme referring to a deer, Sint Hubertus, and that was actually his relation to nature, to let's say to the animal, to the hunting, and to all kinds of religious explanations. And that is one way of giving an answer to the landscape. Because for the rest you could say that it's mainly a theme of being picturesque and cutting up quite a big chunk of building into smaller parts, as we know it from the arts and crafts tradition in the UK. Again, we make images while we work on commissions like this. And this is the whole volume. It's a house, but we use the word country house. It's a country house, and that helps us to understand how we would like to relate to nature and to the environment here. It also helps us to understand the concept of the building, because it needs to express the idea of a house, a welcoming house. After a walk in the park, you want to be welcomed in this house, and that accommodates you, protects you against the rain, but also brings warmth and coverage. So the expression of the roof is an important one. There were actually three references that were very influential throughout the whole design process. And one is the architecture of Lutyens. I will tell a bit more about this later. But another one was the Woodland Chapel by Asplund in the Woodland Cemetery in Stockholm. It's a very, very small, modest, almost cabin. It's a very small building with a pitched roof, a dark pitched roof. And it does not reveal anything of what is happening inside. And when you enter, you see a beautiful cupola, which is not visible from the outside at all. And that means that there is a disconnection between the silhouette of the building and what the interior is actually showing. So that actually gives more priority to the form of the ceiling, you could say, in the interior, while the exterior is telling another story. And that is something of a motive that we literally used for the development of this visitor center park pavilion. Another motive was seeing this café by Lacaton Vasal in Vienna, where the ceiling is richly cladded with tiles, azulejos from Portugal, and you can imagine that everything can change, but the carrier of the space, the bringer of character, is actually the form and the cladding of the ceiling. So gradually the idea arose to let the ceiling tell the story of the building, that would be the main character in the interior of the building. While the exterior would perhaps be more informed by the country houses such as the ones by Lutjens, where Lutjens, perhaps similar to what Berlage did, is making connections with the landscape, not in a way that as some contemporary architects do when they relate to nature by making a hill or by making a piece of forest, but by making vistas and making roofs that stand out in the landscape, figurations and orientation points that become very related to the locality. Especially the enormous monumentality of the gables that we see here was a point of reference. Because when we were thinking of this huge program, we thought we should avoid that it becomes too big for this place. We should cut it up. We divide it into two pitched roofs instead of one pitched roof. We make sure that the long building is not being experienced as a very long building by bending it like a banana, and in such a way you actually have a perspective which is always shortened. But the main motive for the development of this this visitor center is actually in the section. The section is actually where the fun is, because there's a sequence building up. So from the front side of the building, from the parking lot, you will first see the silhouette of the gables, the roofs. And then when you turn around, the tall roof will lower again to a point of 3 meters where the gutter is. So you will enter low, where the building is more modest, you could say. And then you enter, and then you have this ceiling which is not revealed from the outside, only an echo in the gable. And the interior is giving a complete different experience. It's detached from the exterior. That is something that was quite normal among architects before modernism, to make the interior, to give the interior a different narrative than the exterior. This was actually when form follows function was brought in, was the rule, was the new rule. So actually you could say that the ceiling would then cause also the exterior of the building, or then it would also have a curved exterior, or the other way around, that the pitched roof would then automatically also be the form of the ceiling. And I think that is a bit of that's poorness. I think that is a pity, because I think the environment of the interior is a complete different one than the environment of the exterior, and they can be detached. And of course we had conversations with the project manager and our client whether all these pochés here, all these useless spaces were wise. But gradually, we've worked on this project for 7 years. Everybody became more happy with these gray zones, because these gray zones were filled up with all kinds of technical equipment. And we were able to get rid of all the technical equipment. It would not be visible. But back to the section, I was here. So the curved ceiling, and then you are low again and then high in the stairs, and then low again in the corridor here, and then you enter the meeting rooms, and they have their own individual height again. So there's a whole sequence of different heights. And there's a whole serving space in the backside on the ground level where the big kitchen is. You have to imagine this visitor center wants to be a country house, but is at the same time a very banal place that needs to be able to, let's say, process approximately 2,000 people a day. So although it needs to be refined and welcoming, it is also needs to be resistant and to all the things that happen there. Dogs are walking in. Little children are throwing pancakes through the restaurant. So it needs to be resistant. This is the appearance from the parking lot. And here you can see that the gable is quite closed and iconic, and it only gradually reveals something of what is happening there. And then you gradually move closer, and then you get more impressions of what could happen inside. And here we see the section again. And this is a bit of a bitmapped image of our ambition for the interior. That the interior would actually be one continuous space where the shop would be in the same space as the restaurant, which would only be divided by the entrance, and that everything would be bound together by wooden paneling. And the wooden paneling is a very literal element from the country house. So it has all kinds of echoes of a country house, some very literal and some more abstract. Here we enter in the middle. Here's the counter, here's the shop, and here's the restaurant. This is all kitchen. This is an extra dining room, and this is storage and offices. And so this is one continuous space. And when you make a curved building, you can make also curved glass, of course, but we thought it would be better to make shark teeth here in order to create a situation with bay windows where you would have more intimate spaces here close to the windows. And when you would be sitting outside, you would be able to sit here. You would be protected against the sun and against the wind. And this is the first floor where you see one long corridor, a service zone in the middle where you enter through a staircase. Then you enter in the foyer, and then you go to the meeting rooms. And we had long discussions with our client to discuss whether this should be one continuous flexible room or whether we would be able to divide them in rooms with character. And that's again a relation to a country house where every room has its own proportion and has its own character. That's also something that we try to obtain here, which is emphasized by the difference in the geometry of the ceilings. The roof. And there's a large balcony on the in the tail. So this is the head of the building, and this is the tail of the building, where the head is formal and iconic, the tail is informal and chaotic. The facades, and this is a quick build-up of how the volume develops. So I go 2 steps back. So in the interior, it was important to see that there was a continuous wooden ring circling around, carrying the ceiling, with gaps in there for seating. and then the individualized meeting rooms on top. And then the restaurant and the shop and the people. And this is how you can see it from another angle. And what was important for us was that we would develop a strategy that would bind everything together, yet would be able to allow us to make differences. So this strategy of the lamellas or the verticals allows you to bring this coherence, while simultaneously every side is different and every side has to also contain a different narrative. So here we go around the corner and you see that the bay windows are sticking out. And actually this is also a continuation of the same lamello structure, but then the distance is bigger. The material palette is a combination of brick with aluminium anodized in a champagne color, which is between gold and silver, you could say. Our client immediately has asked us not to build in wood in this project 7 years ago. Nowadays I would probably have a longer discussion with our client about this. But you have to imagine that wood really very quickly, rapidly gets dirty in this forest environment. Everything gets dirty, of course, every building, but this is more resistant to what is coming from the leaves and the trees. This is actually the only site where you can see the full building in its full length, because from all the other sites you will almost never experience the full length, because the curve is always preventing you. And when you make such a large roof, you need also elements to break up this large surface, and therefore we use these dormer windows that bring light into the interior. But also the material palette, especially the color of the bricks, is related to the sand grounds in the environment. And this is the more informal tail of the building, where you see how the balcony is individualizing and then folding back again to the level of the roof line. And also this building cannot have a backside, but at the same time you need a distribution area. This is the non-representative side, so to say, which also needed to be beautiful. Here you can see how the vertical ribs continue. And this is what happens in a country house. There's not only an audience of people enjoying nature that visits here the visitor center, but there's also a whole tradition of hunting, military, so that also causes emblems like this, and it welcomes you when you enter the visitor center. Here you can see how the bay windows offer places, and on one side of the building, on one side of the building the lights shines in on the north side, and on the other side, the tail of the building, you have a large chimney, which is much too large. And that's a very literal element again of something that we can also find in country houses. But it's much too large, but we took it serious. It has tailor-made tiles from the Royal Tigelaar factory, and everything is tailor-made. And you can also see that well, it's in function nowadays if you visit it, and everything is cladded with oak veneer. And the meeting rooms as well. And this is how you can find it in the evening. And this was it. Thank you very much.